but today I'm not going to like Gideon. So Judges chapter 8. The action of the story is pretty much over with, and now we find ourselves exploring the final days of Gideon. Let me grab. Let's start here in verse 22. It says, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian.'" What we have here, starting in verses 22, going down to verse 28, is the scene. Now that Gideon is victorious, the Midianites and the Amalekites and people of the east are pushed away. Gideon is now given an offer most of us could not refuse, and that is the offer of being a king, an offer of real power. So way this section is structured is the people speak to Gideon, and then Gideon speaks to the people. And the narrator sets us up for disappointment. So initially, we were really proud of Gideon, really excited about what he does. But what he says at least, but what he ends up doing becomes real disappointing. So his actions don't match his words. And so put yourself in Israel's situation. They were oppressed politically, militarily, economically, and they don't want that to happen again. And it seems like the best way of doing that is not to have these tribal chieftains at odds with each other, but rather to have a single national leader who can unify the tribes, and together they are more powerful. And given that Gideon can defeat powerful armies with just 300 men, imagine what he could do with a handful of tribes. So if we put ourselves in the tribe's shoes, Americans would do the same thing. Because we want safety over anything else. We Americans, we clearly want safety over liberty. And so the men of Israel, this is probably the elders and other influential people, they want him to become king. And one of the things you'll notice is that the text tries to avoid the language of king. Now there may be a reference to a king, but it'll say things like rule. And that word is used in varieties of contexts. Cain is told to rule over his temptations, lest it rule over him. And then God is said to rule. They're clearly talking about monarchy, but the text avoids it. I think we'll see why. In fact, I've titled this "The Rule of Gideon," because he's going to end up ruling, but he says he doesn't want to rule. And they don't come out and say, "Be a king," because the narrator is playing with us. It's really, really well written. Well, this story, of course, mirrors what's going to happen several generations later. So you get this in 1 Samuel 8. Samuel's the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, said to him, "Hold, you are old, your sons do not walk in your ways," much like Gideon, by the way. "Now appoint for us a king to judge us like the nation." It's interesting, isn't it? The judges, a judge is made a king. And then when they get a king, they want a king to have a judge. It's just so cool. So we are to see this. So Samuel is told to surrender to the desire. But here is the first effort at this sort of government. Now, what's interesting is both generations, the generation of Samuel, generation of Gideon, they suffer under the hands of a foreign power. For Gideon's the Amalekites and Midianites. For Samuel, it is the Philistines. And so coming out of that experience, they think that the only thing that will keep us safe is a king. And after Samuel says, you realize what this means. You go this route, a lot of bad things are going to happen to you. And they say, we'd rather give up liberty in order to have safety. Same debate we still have today. So Gideon, so that's the people to Gideon, and here is Gideon to the people. Verse 23. Gideon said to them, I will rule over you. I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Now, pause there. This is a good Gideon. This is a good guy, right? If only the story ended here in verse 23. Gideon's response, we end up seeing the good and bad of him. So remember that the same Gideon that was gracious to the Ephraimites is the same Gideon that was harsh towards the people of Penuel and Succoth. Gideon has a Jekyll Hyde sort of personality. When he's good, he's great. When he's bad, he's awful. And here we see this. Here is the good guy. And he refuses their offer primarily on the basis of theology. Now, I think there should be more here from Gideon. I think he should say, look, God is your king, the same God that liberated you from the Midianites. But Gideon leaves all that out, but he at least gets the theology right. Two things to point out here. One, this is an example of self-control. How many people, if we're honest with ourselves, would turn down the offer of absolute power of your nation? Now, with that comes a lot of risk and responsibility, of course. But the history of the world, for the most part, is men trying to exercise power over other men. Now, that's basically it. I'm reading a book right now on the history of the monarchy in England. And that's basically the story of the monarchy of England and every nation. It's you have a king and you have all these other people who want to be king. So they have to say, I have a greater claim on the throne and I have an army. Let's see who wins. This is the history of England, history of France, a history of Spain, a history of Portugal, a history, of the Vikings. This is the story of humanity. Now, what sets America apart in this regard is our practice of the peaceful transition of power. Now, I'd never even thought about this until, I was, in my 30-something. I think it was it from Obama to Trump or is Bush to Obama? Whatever it was, one of those. I think it was Mueller, actually. I listened to his briefing. He talked about this, and I thought, you know what? I guess I always took that for granted. That in America, we vote for a guy, and the guy that's in the office either doesn't have a job anymore, and we let him know when he's fired. Right? And he has like 3 months to prepare for life after he's fired. How would you like to have a job where you've been fired, but you have to hang on for 3 months? So either he's fired or he's worked for too long, and we've decided by law we don't want you to work for us past a certain date. Right? That's the American system. And so we say this is the way it is. And then like every president has done this. In fact, one of the great traditions of America is the outgoing president writes a handwritten note, puts it in his desk, and then the next president comes in and he there's that note. And you can actually get online and read some of the notes. I think W's to Obama's really good. HW's to Clinton's is really good. And it's from the outgoing to the incoming president. I love that tradition. We take that for granted. Now, at the rate things are going, we may not be, whether it's this year or 4 years or 40 years from now, I'm a little nervous about this great tradition. But this, of course, comes from George Washington. At the end, or right as the war was winding down for independence against the Brits, King Charles III asked an American loyalist what he thought Washington would do after the war. And the loyalist, we know his name was Benjamin West, said he believed Washington would retire and go home. At which point, George III said, if he does that, he would be the greatest man in the world. Well, it's exactly what Washington did. He retired and went home until his country says, well, we don't just need you to push back the British, we actually need you to run the country. So, and now when he retired, he gave up the title of commander-in-chief. He retired from the military. He had no authority. He was a common citizen. He was subject to the Continental Congress, this new nation. Had no idea what it was going to be like. Retired from all. He could have came into D.C., and his men wanted him to. Well, not D.C., it'd be Philadelphia. And claimed to be king. They were ready to crown him king. He said, no, I'm going to retire. Later, when he was asked to be president, he, of course, served, the only president to win unanimously. And after his second term, he says, I'm not going to be president again. At which point, King George described him as the greatest character of the age. We take this for granted. Here we have Gideon showing a real act of self-control. And he's saying that God delivered us. God is our king, not Gideon. Another thing we need to point out here is the issue of theocracy. Not something we like to talk about as Americans, but Scripture clearly portrays God as the king over Israel, and that was a literal belief. They had a king. His name was Yahweh. I'll give you just a few verses here. Psalm 81. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock. You are enthroned above the cherubim shine forth. Notice the mix of metaphors. He is shepherd, he is king. He is seated enthroned. Shepherds don't sit enthroned. They sit out in the field. Psalm 5:2, listen to my cry for help, my King and my God. Psalm 74, you, O God, are my King from of old. Zephaniah 3, Yahweh, the King of Israel, is with you. But of course, Scripture goes beyond that and says that Israel isn't just Yahweh isn't just king over Israel. He is actually king over the whole cosmos. This is what sets Israel apart from the other nations, is they believe that not just they had a God, but the nations had a God. And it was the same God. And this was the goal of Israel. So you get Psalm 47, sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises. God is king of over all the earth. So he's our king, he's everyone's king. Psalm 95:3, for the Lord is the great God, the great king above all gods. The Lord reigns, Psalm 99, let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim, let the earth quake. Finally, Zechariah 14, the Lord, Yahweh, will be king over the whole earth. This clearly is biblical theology. And of course, what is it that we get in the story of Jesus? We get one who claims to be the king of the kingdom. You remember that Satan tempts him with all the kingdoms of the earth. And one of the problems with that temptation is that Jesus is already the king over the kingdoms of all the earth. It's just that the nations haven't submitted to his lordship yet. And that is what he came to do. Well, good answer by Gideon. Everything from here on out is bad news. Okay, it's just all bad. Verse 24. Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. That is, that the Midianites were connected to the Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil, and the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. So Gideon says, don't make me king. And what does he go do? He goes and act like it. And we are meant to read it that way. In fact, it's worse than that. He wants to be, first of all, treated like a king. He acts like a king. He wants to be treated like a king. Notice the references here. First of all, he gets wealth and honor. The means of his wealth comes from the spoil of battle. So everyone, they get their spoil from the Midianites, Amalekites, and then he basically taxes it. He says, okay, this is all I ask is all that spoil out there, give me my piece, my sizable piece. This is something that kings did. And notice that the spoil was primarily golden earrings. Now, I'm sure there were other things of the spoil. Cattle and sheep and women, frankly, was a common thing. And other sources of wealth and power and everything else. But he wants the earrings. And when you hear golden earrings and someone requesting, bring in all the golden earrings, a certain story should come to mind. And that is the story of the golden calf. Exodus 32. So Aaron said, take off the rings of gold that are in your ears. Now, remember, where did they get all this gold? They got it from the Egyptians. Remember that the Egyptians, who the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites. And now the Egyptians are coming to the Israelites and paying tribute to them. So this is a real reversal of things. So what was supposed to be evidence of God's extravagant grace upon an enslaved people now becomes the means of idolatry. And so he takes the earrings and he fashions them into the golden calf. So what does Gideon do? Well, he takes their earrings and he's going to fashion a ephod. We'll have more to say about that here in a minute. So basically he is making these people his vassals. By taking their spoils, Israel becomes his vassals. 1,700 shekels of gold, that's about 43 pounds of gold, a fitting treasure for a king. He will have to set up a Fort Knox, no doubt. And notice that the jewelry that's given to him, it's described as worn by the kings of Midian. Notice the word king is clearly associated with the Midianites, but because it belongs to the kings of the Midianites, now it belongs to Gideon. How is Gideon wanting to be treated? He's wanting to be treated like the kings of the Canaanites. So he's becoming the very thing God liberated him from. And collars that were around the necks of their camels. So this is just extravagance that he gets. And you'll notice... We'll skip a little bit. We'll do a little bit of back and forth. Go down to verse 30. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine was in Shechem. So notice he has multiple wives, and he has concubines. And what does this sound like? It sounds like David and Solomon and all the others. Kings had a lot of women around them. And these concubines functioned primarily for one purpose, and that was for the pleasure of the king. Like we know this. And so he again is acting like a king. The issue of lineage is there in verse 31. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. So lineage is a big concern for kings. Again, I'm reading the book about the British monarchy. Every king is worried about who's going to replace them. Look at Henry VIII, where he really obsessed over that. So in verse 31, we get his son, who becomes like a king in chapter 9. But go back up again to the request in verse 22. Rule over us, your son and your grandson, for you saved us from the Midianites. Of course, it was God who did that. So Abimelech could mean three things, and they're all bad. Here's what I think the first reading of the text. And that is, think of Abba, means God. Or father. Abi, that I is the first person possessive, my. So Eli means my God. So Eli lama sabachthana, my God, my God. So you have my father, Melech. Now this is where the debate is. There is a God that goes by the name of Melech, has a certain meaning to it. But Melech in Hebrew means king. So he names his son, my father is king. So you don't have king in directly reference to Gideon except in the language of lineage. Now, again, this name could be referencing other things, a lot of debate about that, but I think on the surface this is clearly the point that we get here. And so he receives a lot of the benefits of power, but perhaps without some of the responsibilities. So here we see Gideon as king, but also notice he presents himself as priest, verse 27. This weird passage, I read this and it was just so weird. Gideon made an ephod of all the gold he was given, and he put it in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Tim Keller is really helpful here in his commentary on this text. He writes, the ephod was worn by the high priest in the tabernacle, which at this point was sited in Shiloh. David would move it from Shiloh to Jerusalem. But for a while, it's in Shiloh. And he gives a reference there in Judges 18. On its front were the Urim and the Thummim. If you know anything about Mormonism, this is supposedly what Joseph Smith used to translate the Book of Mormon. But these are these weird stones. So there are two stones, basically for yes or no. I get lost in all this. But regardless, so you have this ephod. They have these stones in them, among other precious jewels. The ephod designated the true place of God's dwelling and was a way to discern God's will in times of crisis, particularly that Urim and Thummim. In making his own copy, so Gideon makes a new ephod. There's an ephod in Shiloh where the ark is. He makes his own. He sets up his own hometown as a rival place of worship. He wants to encourage people to come to him for guidance. Not to Yahweh as Shiloh, to see his hometown as the place where God can be found. Gideon has used God to consolidate his own position instead of using his position to serve and be used by God. So one of the things that we've talked about in the past is the theme of the royal priest. And there's many in the Bible where they function as a type of monarch and as a priestly function. These two are to be separate at all times in Israel. But then we get these characters that mixes them. Think of Abraham. Think of Isaac. Really think of Melchizedek, king of Salem, whom Abraham pays a tithe to. Jethro is a royal priest. He's the king over the Midianites, but also he functions as a priest. He prays in that. David will do this. Remember, David wears an ephod and dances upon the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem and all that. And so we see this weird... He's not supposed to be doing that. Solomon does this too. They're not supposed to be doing that. Solomon prays at the dedication of the temple. The priest should do that, but Solomon does it. He's king, not priest. And so we see this mixture. Gideon, I think, is doing this, but he usurps the authority. This is not authority given to him like Melchizedek or David. He usurps it for himself. So he takes the role not just as king, but as priest. So if you want to discern the will of God, you come to Gideon. Here we have one who thinks, at least act as prophet, priest, and king. And he isn't any of these things. So, now, there's a lot of debate about everything that was his ephod. The text doesn't tell us that he wore it. It tells us that he displayed it. And it's possible that what Gideon is doing is a common practice in ancient Near East world, where acts of clothing take on the role of like an idol. Thus Gideon may be setting up, now get this, remember when he last left Ophrah, he destroyed his father's altar of Baal. And the going theory is this ephod is the new altar to Baal. In fact, if you go down, verse 33, as soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and played the harlot after the Baals and the Baal Berith, their god. Where was there an altar to Baal? It was right there in Ophrah. And it was Gideon's father who had it set up. So now Gideon takes all this wealth and he fashions his own ephod, not an ephod of Yahweh, his own. And he sets it up, perhaps reestablishing the altar he once destroyed. Now, what was the point of everything with Gideon? It was for Israelites to repent and say, God delivered us. And he did it with 300 men. What happens in the end? Is Gideon, the one who's right there and sees everything up close, he turns around and says, you know what? You're right. I did it. You go back up to verse 22. You saved us from the Midianites. See, it's all bad news. Man, I was falling in love with Gideon. Fall in love with him. And then you get all this sort of stuff. Well, verse 28, notice there, Midian was subdued before the people of Israel. They raised their heads no more. The land had rest for 40 years. So we could say that Gideon ruled for 40. He didn't judge, he ruled. This is unique among the judges. Remember that the judges are going to get worse as we go. The next supposed judge, Abimelech, is awful. And then Jephthah has a lot of problems. Samson, you know them. And then ends up in civil war by the end. So it's not a happy ending of a book. Now, the fact that there's rest for 40 years is more evidence of God's grace. 40 years, the number 40 plays a significant role throughout the Bible. I think in this context, it tells us this is an entire generation. Remember, it was 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. It was the death of an entire generation. So what you have is the generation of Gideon, they find rest. This is the goal of the Bible, to find rest in God's land. And they finally accomplish it. But the minute Gideon dies, they go back to the world of chaos. So that's the rule of Gideon. Here finally is the death of Gideon, verse 29. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring. He had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash's father at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So much going on here. The domestic life of Gideon as a type of king is laid out here in 29 to 30. Notice again, he's never called king. Never called king except through his son. However, the language of monarchy is there. We've already seen some of it. Notice this language, verse 29. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash. That's the language of a dynasty. He's not called a king, but he's called everything but a king. And I think it's significant that the name Jerubbaal is used instead of Gideon. I don't think that's an accidental, because perhaps the writer wants us to see that the man who was supposed to contend with Baal has now lost that battle. Remember, Jerubbaal means the one who contends with Baal. And you remember his dad says, look, if destroying the altar is bad, let Baal contend with him. Let's see who wins in the end. And then Gideon goes out there and wins these battles. And you think, look at there, Gideon contended with Baal and won. And then the writer's saying, yeah, you remember he was supposed to contend? He lost. In the end, he just returned everything to the way it was without the Midianites. So we, the reader, are saying Israel is still oppressed. Their oppression doesn't come by the hands of the Midianites or the Amalekites. It comes by the oppression of Baal, which was always the source of their oppression. As you've probably heard preachers say before, the Israelites coming out of Egypt. You could take the Israelite out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get the Egypt out of the Israelites. And you're seeing that right here. Here's the thing. Changing the political atmosphere does not fix the spiritual state of a nation. I wish I could think of a good application and example. Because what we are doing as Americans, Christians are doing this. If we get our guy in office, if we pass our policies, we will be a spiritually good nation. No, you've got to get the idols out of the lands. And this is where Israel failed. They compromised and therefore became like their neighbors. So verse 29, he lived in his house. This bizarre phrase hints at Gideon ruling. The writer doesn't want to say he's the king, but the reader knows that's what he's saying. So he lived in his own house. Where else are you going to live? The doghouse, right? I'm sure he's married, of course. He's got, but I'm sure his doghouse is nicer than everyone else's. But nevertheless, he dies, and actually, verse 30, you see that he has 70 sons. This is interesting. 70 sons. The language of 70 sons does show up. Exodus 1:5. All the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, which is I think that's King James language. So Jacob, basically, you put it all together, there's 70 from there. Give me one more example. Ahab, King Ahab, had 70 sons in Samaria. Now, Ahab was a bad guy. So you got Jacob, a good guy. You got Ahab, a bad guy. And here, so 70, for those of you who went to public school, 70 is the number 7 multiplied 10 times. Okay? So it is like the perfect number. So for example, when Jesus is asked, how often should I forgive my neighbor? What does he say? Not just 7 times, which is far more than the expectations. More than double what the Pharisees said. 70 times 7. So you take that perfect number, and then you're going to multiply it by 7 more times. And now, these are just 2 examples related to sons. You can look at other examples of 70. 70 shows up all over in the tabernacle. It's all over, I think, in Numbers. You see it just everywhere. He has many wives. Again, Action of Kings, concubines. Now, verse 32. Gideon, the son of Joash. So now we're back to Gideon. But notice the dynastic language. The son of Joash died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father. That's what kings do. You get buried in the tombs of your father. At Ophrah of the Abiezerites. So that phrase, good old age, is used elsewhere. I'll give you the 2 references. Abraham is said that he will live in a good old age. Later, Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age. So this is the goal. This is all of us. It isn't that you die of old age. You die of a good old age. And the idea is you die, you can look at your legacy as you die. I mentioned last Thursday I went to a funeral of a really special lady named Leona Whitworth, served at Goshen Baptist Church. Gosh, how many kids she have? Bunches. Far too many boys. Was it 4 boys, 2 girls, something like that? Yeah, big family. Was it 17 grandkids, 23 great-grandkids, 3 great-great-grandkids, okay? That's the goal in life. She died at age 92. In fact, one of the reasons I suspected that she was dying or had died before there was any announcement is I started to notice, and I'm friends with a lot of that family on Facebook, started noticing a lot of photos of Leona on Facebook. Like, well, one, you thought, oh, it's just her birthday. I don't know. And she's not on Facebook. And then you start seeing a bunch. And they were all like, here's her granddaughter with Leona. Here's her son and his wife with his mother. Like all of that. And I thought, something's going on. And then the announcement came out a few weeks later, pray for the family, we just lost our matriarch. That's a good life. That's a good life. Like no one goes on their deathbed wishing they had spent more time at the office. Now notice here, we love and hate Gideon at the same time. For all the bad things he does and all the doubt he struggled with, God is still gracious to him. I don't have to understand that. But isn't it good news that God is gracious to people, even to disobedient people, like you and me? And that's okay. We should be thankful for that we worship that sort of God. Well, let's look at his legacy, verse 33, and we're done. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and played the harlot after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. And the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. Kind of a mixed bag here, isn't it? The writer's critical that the minute Gideon died, they returned to the gods that Gideon had led them down the path to worship. But what really bothers him is they didn't honor Gideon for 40 years of peace. And as a result, they're going to get a mess with Abimelech, that you get the whole chapter of chapter 9. Now, here we see they return to idolatry. Well, this gives us a hint of the sort of sons he's raising, doesn't it? Because it's clear he's a king, which means his sons will fight for the throne. What is their character? Well, clearly it's one of idolatry. Again, you read Abimelech, and he's a monster. And here you see worshiping Baal Berith. Baal Berith means Lord of the Covenant. It's a deity of Shechem. It's referenced in chapter 9, verse 4. There's a lot of debate regarding this specific version of Baal that I get lost in, so I don't know what to do with it. But nevertheless, it's interesting that they, verse 34, they did not remember the Lord their God. And then in verse 35, they did not show steadfast love to the family of Gideon. Well, I think, maybe this is they didn't really honor him and all that sort of, and his family, which is dynastic language. But the truth is, Israel was supposed to remember and to obey the God who shows steadfast love. The whole point of the story is not Gideon's steadfast love for Israel, but Yahweh's steadfast love for Israel. Because we get to the end of Gideon's story and we're thinking, man, if you're God, I tried. I mean, we took out like a dozen kingdoms with 300 rednecks who knew how to drink water without a weapon. They lit things on fire and blew trumpets. I did that. Me. Not him, me. And so they are to marvel at God's steadfast love, that despite their disobedience, God was merciful. It's a terrible ending of a story, isn't it? But that's the point of Judges. Every man did what was right in their own eyes. They could even say, don't make me a king, the Lord is your king. But give me all the trappings and everything that comes with it except for the title. And the writer is toying with us in that. Never calls him king. That's exactly what he was. Well, what is the major application? I really have enjoyed Gideon, and we've seen all kinds of good applications. The main one, I'm kind of cheating here, because I was reading Gideon, and I thought a lot about David and Solomon. What bothers me so much about David and Solomon is they started out so well, but they didn't finish well. And I know we're doing that on Sunday morning, so I don't want to belabor the point. But there is something about finishing well that the Bible keeps returning to over and over and over again. How we finish is more important than how we start. Because Gideon didn't start out too good. He was a man of many doubts, many uncertainties. But right there in the middle, he hit his peak and he did well. But he didn't maintain that. And he just went right back to where he was. And the Bible is screaming, learn from Gideon. Trust in the Lord. Trust in His steadfast love and kindness towards His people, even to a people who don't deserve it. But above all, finish well. Well, Danny's not here to tell us if we missed anything. We got him up too early. That's the problem. Yeah, he came to breakfast. He got up too early. Yeah, he probably ate too much. All right, anything else that we missed? That's Gideon. There is a chance we're going to take a break from Judges, and the reason is pretty simple. I read a book, and it's a really, really good book. It's got me thinking. We may pause from Judges, we may not, because Abimelech is connected to Gideon, but we may look at the transfiguration of Jesus. We were talking about this Sunday morning. Sometimes we get locked into a book, and at times I need a break. And Judges is pretty dense. So there's a good chance we'll look at Transfiguration. It is amazing how much is in that story. So we'll figure out next week. All right, I'm tired of talking.